In the summer of 1972, in a quiet residential area on the edge of the Nevada desert, 4-year-old Ella Morgan climbed into her father Douglas's dark-colored car for what he said would be a quick ride around town. 20 minutes later, the car turned off the road that led home, and both of them vanished from the map of America. No accident, no witnesses, no trace left behind except the empty car abandoned in a vacant lot a few hours later. Police searched for months, then years, but every lead dissolved into nothing. They told Ella's mother, Marilyn, that Douglas had probably taken the child to start a new life somewhere, and time would let the case go cold, like so many other parental abductions of the 1970s. Town rumors whispered that he might have had help, because no lone father could disappear completely from the system overnight. Then, in the 2010s, when genetic labs began retesting old DNA samples, an unexpected match appeared. An adult woman who had submitted a consumer DNA test to learn about her ancestry carried segments that matched Marilyn's almost perfectly. What shocked investigators wasn't just the degree of the match, but the question that came with it: where had Ella been living for the past 44 years? And who else had helped Douglas make a 4-year-old child disappear from the world without leaving a single piece of paper behind? Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys to find long-forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Nevada in 1972 still looked like a half-wild, slowly developing desert land, where small towns like Fernley sat between vast desert and distant purple mountain ranges. The Morgan family lived in a quiet neighborhood where houses were far enough apart for privacy, but close enough that neighbors still recognized each other every morning. Marilyn Carter, a part-time nurse and single mother, raised her 4-year-old daughter Ella in a steady routine, mornings preparing food, afternoons resting together, occasional visits to neighbor Ruth Myers to chat. Their life was simple, but reliably predictable. But on that fateful morning, small signs began to break the familiar calm. The night before, Ella said she had heard noises outside the window, the sound of shoes grinding on gravel, as if someone had stopped and then walked away. Marilyn hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was a cat or neighborhood kids playing, but that morning when she stepped outside, she noticed strange tire tracks in the hard, dry dirt in front of the house, tracks that didn't match any familiar vehicles in the area. Ruth Myers, the elderly neighbor who sat on her porch every morning, also mentioned seeing a dark car parked at the end of the street very early, not belonging to anyone in the neighborhood. While Marilyn was still puzzled by these oddities, Douglas Morgan, Ella's biological father, who had been living separately from the family for years, suddenly showed up at the door near late morning. His unannounced visit immediately put Marilyn on guard, but Ella was excited to see her dad. Douglas said he just wanted to take Ella out for a little while, to visit and maybe get something to eat. Marilyn's hesitation was obvious. Their relationship had been cold for a long time, and Douglas's presence was no longer familiar. Still, seeing Ella's excitement and Douglas acting calm, Marilyn reluctantly agreed, intending for it to be a short trip. From her porch, Ruth watched Douglas carry Ella to the car, noticing how he shielded most of the child's body as he put her in the back seat, along with an unexplained hurried manner. As the car pulled away from the driveway and headed toward the road that connected to the highway, Marilyn stood at the door feeling something was wrong, but unable to pinpoint it. Half an hour passed, then an hour, then more, but Douglas did not bring Ella back as silently promised when he left. When Marilyn called the old phone number Douglas had once given her, she got only a disconnected tone. Uneasiness turned to panic as she started walking the neighborhood, knocking on doors asking if anyone had seen which way the car went. Ruth only remembered the car driving away faster than normal, not like a short joyride. No one else had more information, and the early signs were too vague to form any clear lid. The feeling of losing control turned to terror when Marilyn realized Ella was gone for real. Unable to wait any longer, she ran inside, picked up the phone, and called the police to report that her daughter had been taken and was not coming back. Marilyn's call reached the Lyon County Sheriff's Office dispatch center just minutes after she frantically dialed, and the operator quickly realized this was not a typical lost child situation. The report of a 4-year-old girl taken by a father who had been estranged for years was immediately classified as a possible abduction, triggering high-priority protocol. A patrol unit already near the neighborhood was sent to Marilyn's house and arrived within minutes to begin documenting the initial scene. The house still showed the mild mess of a morning, suddenly interrupted, but more important were the mother's state of mind and the consistency between her account and the neighbor's statement. Officers separated Marilyn from the gathering neighbors in the front yard to ask the essential questions: exact time Douglas arrived, description of the car, what he was wearing, what Ella had on when she left. Marilyn struggled to recall every detail through a trembling voice and fear-clouded mind. Meanwhile, another officer went to take a statement from Ruth Myers, who had the best vantage point. Ruth provided details about the car parked at the end of the street very early, and how Douglas hurriedly carried Ella into it, as well as the direction the car took after leaving the driveway. These scattered pieces were recorded and preliminarily assessed, establishing that this was intentional unauthorized removal of a child, rather than an extended casual visit. With the most critical information gathered, investigators immediately built an initial abduction timeline. The first marker was Douglas's arrival, late morning according to Marilyn. The second was when he put Ella in the car. The third was when Marilyn started searching and called police. By cross-referencing these 3 points with Ruth's description of the departure direction, officers quickly calculated how many minutes Douglas had before police were notified, and from that, a realistic search radius. Once the timeline was clearer, they created 1,972 standard victim and suspect profiles. Ella's profile included physical description, age, approximate height, distinguishing features, clothing at time of disappearance, and family details. Douglas's profile was built in parallel from information Marilyn provided: age, appearance, relationship to the child, marital status, last known address. This data was entered into the era's manual internal records system and copied for distribution to cooperating agencies. With basic profiles complete, the lead officer activated a county-wide BOLO, be on the lookout, broadcasting descriptions of Douglas, Ella, and the vehicle to every patrol car, traffic checkpoint, and neighboring agency that might lie along routes leaving Fernley. Simultaneously, dispatch sent alerts to major gas stations and rest stops along the nearest highways, asking staff to report any sighting of the vehicle or the father and daughter. Issuing the BOLO marked the end of the very first response phase and laid the groundwork for the next tracing steps as the entire local law enforcement network began moving to hunt for the first solid sign of Douglas Morgan and little Ella, who had just vanished from this small town. Vehicle tracing operations spread outward from the neighborhood while the BOLO was still being issued, and assigned officers quickly began the cycle of checking every plausible stop that might have recorded the car's passage. Gas stations, small grocery stores, and roadside diners along routes leaving Fernley became top priority checkpoints. The number of locations was limited by 1972 Nevada geography, so the list was narrowed to a logical chain within the radius calculated from the original timeline. The gas station on the road leading to the interstate provided the most valuable information. The attendant clearly remembered a car matching the description stopping that morning. The man acted rushed, bought the minimum amount of gas, and left quickly. The presence of a little girl in the back seat was confirmed, though no further description was possible. This sighting reinforced the departure direction investigators had already built from Ruth's account and the timing of Douglas leaving the house. The gas station data helped form the basis for reconstructing possible next legs of the journey. From the station's location, the distance Douglas had already traveled was calculated using road conditions and reasonable speeds, given the light traffic. The area around Fernley in 1972 offered only two main directions, the connector to I-80 or smaller roads heading north or south. Infrastructure at the time made any major turn easy to spot, so investigators focused on mapping the routes with the fewest choices, routes Douglas would have to take if maintaining steady speed. Officers continued canvassing subsequent stops, especially stores along the highway connector, hoping for more witness statements about route or timing. An employee at a small store near a secondary road junction confirmed a similar vehicle passed without stopping, and the driver's appearance matched the preliminary descriptions of Douglas. Taken together, these sightings showed a journey consistent with heading east-west out of Fernley, and matching the timeline inferred from Marilyn's emergency call. The data points on the map began forming a relatively clear travel corridor, allowing coordinators to deploy blocking and containment tactics. Patrol cars were positioned at intersections between secondary roads and I-80, while another team was sent to branches leading into desert areas, where Douglas might try to avoid populated zones. At key traffic points, mobile units set up observation posts to screen vehicles matching the description and report immediately, if anything matched. Meanwhile, the analysis team kept calculating how far Douglas could have traveled since the last being seen. Using fuel consumption, terrain, traffic density, and road conditions, they established a realistic range for the hours that had already passed. The marked zone on the map stretched eastward, where I-80 was the largest artery, and the easiest way for someone wanting to quickly leave the sparsely populated region. Additional reports from farther out stores came in and were cross-checked, though most offered nothing definitive. Still, they were useful for ruling out directions Douglas had not taken, allowing resources to concentrate on the highest probability zone, rather than spreading thin. The vehicle tracing effort progressed by steadily narrowing possibilities and reinforcing whatever remained most likely. The entire investigation team entered a time chase mode, aiming to secure the next positive identification before the trail faded into Nevada's vast emptiness. Connecting on-scene information, witness statements, and field analysis created the first clear picture of the route Douglas had likely chosen, shifting the investigation from local to regional scale, while putting pressure on the patrol units now surrounding the corridors he could still be using to keep moving farther from Fernley. As information was being compiled from gas stations and stores along the route, a report from a resident dozens of miles away from Fernley immediately created a turning point. A local resident called the sheriff's office hotline to report that a vehicle matching the description in the bolo had been parked motionless near a vacant lot right off the highway toward Winnemucca. It had been there for many hours, but no one had returned to it. The nearest patrol unit was dispatched to the location for an initial check before other investigative teams arrived to assist. Upon approaching the vehicle, the officer confirmed the license plate and characteristics matched the car Douglas had used to leave Marilyn's house. There were no signs of collision, the windows and body were intact, the doors were closed but not fully locked. No one was in the immediate vicinity, and the area around the vacant lot showed no fresh signs of movement, such as a second set of tire tracks or any other prolonged stop. The initial search was conducted according to standard procedure to avoid disturbing any potential evidence. Inside the driver's compartment, officers checked the seat position, remaining fuel level, and the arrangement of items that might suggest whether Douglas had left the vehicle in haste or deliberately. The rear compartment showed Ella was no longer there, and there were no signs of luggage or personal belongings. A few small miscellaneous items were found, but nothing sufficient to infer the next leg. Most were ordinary everyday objects with no documents or direct clues to a specific destination. The fact the vehicle had been abandoned without any signs of forced entry or intentional damage led investigators to lean toward the theory that Douglas had switched to another vehicle. The possibility that he had been picked up by an acquaintance or had pre-arranged a second mode of transportation became the focus of analysis. The vacant lot where the car was found was in a relatively concealed location, visible only from a narrow angle on the main road, consistent with a choice made by someone wanting to avoid detection while changing vehicles. Officers searched for other tire marks in the area, but the hard ground and strong wind had erased most traces, making it difficult to identify the type of second vehicle. Investigators conducted a survey of the surrounding area within a wide radius, including a side road leading into a sparsely populated desert stretch. This was a place where trucks or larger vehicles occasionally stopped, increasing the likelihood that Douglas had chosen a discreet spot to board another vehicle before leaving. There were no reports from nearby residents of unusual activity, but the remote nature of the area meant such activity could easily go unnoticed. Re-examining the original timeline, investigators calculated the window during which Douglas could have reached this location and departed without being followed. If the vehicle switch theory was correct, the search area had to be expanded in directions consistent with routes the second vehicle might have taken, no longer limited to the previous one-way corridor. Roads heading north and east, which were less monitored, were flagged for deployment of units. The Coordination Center created a new map based on the abandoned vehicle's location, combined with distance and estimated time data from the early stages of the investigation. A wide search corridor was established, encompassing rest stops, major junctions, and areas with low traffic volume but favorable for travel without drawing attention. Expanding the search required investigators to reallocate personnel, focusing on directions where Douglas would likely want to avoid major cities, while also backtracking possible locations where he might have arranged the vehicle switch. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle became a critical milestone, marking Douglas's deliberate break from his initial trail, and pushing the investigation into a new, more unpredictable phase that forced patrol units to shift strategy and extend the search beyond previously identified routes. The discovery of the abandoned vehicle forced the entire task force to shift from a linear tracking strategy to a dispersed area-wide search, beginning with the rapid mobilization of every resource the local agencies could deploy. K-9 units were brought to the vehicle site to attempt to pick up the scent of Douglas and Ella, although strong winds and hard, dry ground were unfavorable for retaining tracks. The search dogs still followed protocol, sweeping in arcs from the vehicle toward any signs of recent human activity. The sheriff's helicopter and a support unit from a neighboring county were deployed to fly along routes heading east and north, where flat terrain and wide visibility allowed pilots to spot anomalies such as abandoned vehicles, temporary camps, or smoke from fires. Local search teams, including volunteers and rescue personnel, fanned out from the boundaries of the lot where the car was found, checking small trails and seldom used areas. The effort aimed both to locate direct signs of Ella and to determine whether Douglas had continued on foot or reached a rendezvous to switch vehicles. During the expanded search, the sheriff's tip line began receiving numerous reports from residents in towns along the interstate corridors. Several people reported seeing a man with a young girl, but the details were inconsistent, and many were quickly ruled out after verification because the child's age, hair color, or behavior did not match Ella's description. Although they produced no breakthrough, these tips were valuable for eliminating directions and narrowing the areas requiring focus rather than spreading resources too thin. Combining data from helicopter sweeps, K-9 results, and scattered witness reports, investigators assessed there was a high probability Douglas had already left the immediate vicinity of the abandoned vehicle. The time gap between when he likely left the car and when it was reported was long enough for him to have traveled farther, especially if he had been picked up or had a pre-arranged second vehicle. The absence of extended ground traces, together with the fact the car was undamaged, reinforced the conclusion that abandoning the vehicle was part of a plan to break any pursuit based on the original car. This analysis compelled the on-scene commander to adjust the search strategy. Instead of concentrating solely around the discovery site, the search grid was expanded into 3 primary corridors based on routes Douglas would likely choose to minimize detection. Patrol teams were positioned along connecting roads between Fernley, Winnemucca, and smaller towns, while helicopters conducted sweeps over open land, where a second vehicle could easily travel. Gas stations and stores farther along the routes continued to be contacted to verify any unfamiliar customers within the relevant time frame. Part of the new plan also included checking long-haul truck parking lots, where interstate trips often originate, and where Douglas might have blended in to leave Nevada unnoticed. All these efforts aimed to create a wide but focused containment ring in hopes of locating the next break in Douglas's trail before the distance between the suspect and law enforcement grew unmanageable. The widening search revealed a strong likelihood that Douglas had moved beyond local agencies' jurisdiction, and the fact the vehicle was abandoned at a major traffic junction raised the probability he had used interstate highways to leave Nevada, prompting investigators to contact the FBI for assistance under federal cross-state kidnapping authority. A case summary containing descriptions of Douglas, Ella, and the vehicle status was forwarded to the regional FBI office, where agents immediately began cross-referencing it with federal databases and vehicle tracking systems along major interstates. The Joint Federal State Task Force compiled a list of likely stops Douglas may have made after abandoning the car, prioritizing motels, rest areas, and stores along routes from Nevada into Idaho and Utah. Screening began with the closest facilities, where Douglas might have stopped to arrange a second vehicle or rest briefly before continuing. Motel registration logs were manually reviewed, checking Douglas's real name and any variations he might have used. At that point, the most notable lead appeared in the guest register of a small motel near the Idaho border, where an unfamiliar name was written in handwriting inconsistent with regular guests, and the vehicle description listed matched the color and model of Douglas's car before it was abandoned. This suggested he had used a false or untraceable identity while trying to avoid leaving easily identifiable traces. Investigators further analyzed receipts, check-in and check-out times to estimate his next direction of travel. Data from the Idaho, Utah region indicated Douglas may have continued east or northeast, where numerous secondary roads allowed him to avoid patrol surveillance and limit contact with local communities. The federal team also examined behavioral patterns of individuals who used false identities in similar abduction cases, leading to the hypothesis that Douglas may have prepared alternate identification or names before arriving at Marilyn's house. Using the time and location data from the motel stay, distances to subsequent towns were calculated, based on road conditions to identify likely destinations if he aimed to maximize distance in minimal time. Interstate rest stops, long-haul truck parking areas, and junctions with secondary routes were added to the priority screening list. Combining all available information, investigators outlined a high-probability corridor for Douglas's current movement, stretching from southern Idaho to northern Utah. This region features numerous intersecting roads and scattered small communities, ideal for someone wishing to remain unnoticed. Factoring in Douglas's rapid disappearance after abandoning the vehicle in Nevada, law enforcement concluded he was not acting impulsively, but following a relatively clear travel plan, indicating the abduction had been prepared more thoroughly than initial scene evidence suggested. The data obtained from Idaho and Utah helped shape a region where Douglas might have passed through, but the vast distances and inconsistencies in the reports caused valuable information to become increasingly scarce. In the following days, the volume of tips from the public dropped noticeably. Many reports were purely speculative or unsubstantiated, such as sightings of a man with a little girl at some store or rest stop without any verifiable physical details. Most cases were quickly ruled out due to mismatches in age, voice, or context. Meanwhile, the investigation team attempted to backtrack any administrative trail Douglas might have left, but every effort to access education, medical, or employment systems in small towns yielded nothing. There were no enrollment records under the names Ella, Douglas, or any plausible variations matching their descriptions. This was particularly unusual for a child, as even minimal medical care or school registration would normally leave a paper trail, yet the complete absence of anything indicated Douglas had succeeded in keeping Ella entirely outside official systems from the moment they left Nevada. In the financial realm, FBI agents combed through banks, credit unions and tax records across multiple states, but found no sign of activity by Douglas. No new accounts, no loans, no evidence of bank transactions. People who abandon mainstream life sometimes still leave indirect clues, but this case suggested Douglas was operating entirely in cash or relying on untraceable identity-free income sources. The complete absence of any modern financial footprint for years made the next investigative steps unclear, because every hypothesis based on civil record systems could not be pursued further. Meanwhile, public tips continued to lose value. Submissions typically described men with young children at truck stops, roadside diners, or travel plazas. When checked, almost all proved unrelated. A few reports initially seemed promising, for example, locals seeing a man and a girl avoiding interaction inside a store in Idaho, but when partial surveillance footage was reviewed or staff interviewed, nothing matched. The repetition of false leads forced investigators to overhaul their tip triaging process to avoid wasting manpower on duplicates or low-reliability reports. Resources allocated to the case, already stretched thin by the enormous search area, came under increasing strain as time passed without a breakthrough. Federal patrol units were reassigned to other duties once no concrete leads remained to follow. Helicopter support flights were scaled back because no high-priority zones could be identified. K-9 units could not maintain a scent trail for long given the vast terrain and the many days that had elapsed since the vehicle was abandoned. The sheriff's coordination team also reduced dedicated personnel, retaining only a small group to process remaining tips and re-examine previously collected data. Public pressure began to ease as the case dragged on, causing media attention to shift to newer stories. This reduced spontaneous public tips and lowered the chances of receiving a valuable last-minute report. As every resource diminished, the investigation entered a stalled phase where efforts gradually shifted from active searching to bare minimum maintenance, waiting for new data with no guarantee it would ever arrive. The dwindling leads forced the team to return to the body of information collected during the initial phase for a comprehensive re-evaluation of the entire approach, and this consolidation became the last major push to find a breakthrough before the file no longer justified continued active pursuit. Witness reports, gas station and store receipts, motel records, initial statements from Marilyn and Ruth, findings from the abandoned vehicle, and FBI data were compiled into one cohesive master file to check for continuity. Analysts reconstructed Douglas's likely route from Fernley to the vehicle drop-off point, cross-referencing timelines and reported directions of travel to see if anything had been overlooked or contradicted. Some early leads were confirmed as consistent, Douglas appearing in the neighborhood, a gas station attendant seeing the vehicle, and probable stops along the main corridors leaving Nevada. However, most of this data only corroborated the initial phase and did not unlock the next leg of the journey. When assessing the usefulness of each clue, the team found they could create a relatively coherent timeline but lacked the depth needed to determine Douglas's movements after abandoning the car. Major gaps appeared at critical junctures. No one saw Douglas leave the lot where the vehicle was left, no description of a second vehicle, no sufficiently reliable later gas station or motel information to re-establish his location. These gaps made continued proactive investigation unsustainable because any new direction would rest on speculation rather than verifiable data. Further filtering of leads confirmed that almost everything remaining lacked practical value for expanding the search. Reports of possible child matches had already been checked and excluded. Scattered sightings from Idaho and Utah were either too vague or outside a reasonable time window. Financial and administrative records simply did not exist, leaving no way to track him through government systems. Items recovered from the abandoned vehicle offered no specific directional clues, so forensic analysis produced no progress. Meanwhile, field resources had dropped to levels that could not sustain a broad, low-evidence manhunt indefinitely. Faced with this reality, Command began preparing the conditions to reclassify the file as a cold case. This did not mean completely closing the investigation, but rather shifting it to passive monitoring status, ready to reactivate only if fresh leads emerged. To do so, the team had to finalize a detailed summary of everything done. Areas searched, individuals interviewed, routes examined, reliability rating of every tip, and every theory considered. This complete file would ensure any future investigator could pick up the case without missing foundational details. Once the summary was finished, leadership scaled back operations, withdrew most patrol units and surveillance flights, and retained only a small team to receive any new information that might surface. Suspending direct pursuit became the unavoidable decision when no data remained to justify further active leads, marking the moment the hunt for Douglas went dormant, and the case slowly transitioned into archival status, where time and chance became the only factors capable of changing the outcome. Suspending the active search resulted in the Ella Morgan file being officially transferred to the state's cold case unit, where long-term missing persons cases without new developments are stored, periodically reviewed, and kept ready for future leads. Investigator Leonard Hayes, experienced with decades-old cases, was assigned to take over the file. Immediately upon receiving the complete set of documents from local agencies and the FBI, Hayes began a fresh, pressure-free review of every piece of evidence. His work started with rereading every original report, from Marilyn's and Ruth's statements to gas station and motel data, route maps, and patrol logs. Scattered notes were reorganized to assess accuracy and contextual importance. From there, Hayes built a comprehensive 1972-1978 timeline containing every verifiable milestone. Douglas arriving at Marilyn's house, the departure, the first confirmed gas station sighting, the journey to the vehicle abandonment site, and the scattered later witness reports, all arranged into the most coherent sequence possible. The huge gap after the vehicle drop-off remained the breaking point in the entire trail, and it convinced Hayes this belonged to the hardest-to-track category, especially with zero administrative, financial or social system re-entries by Douglas. This review allowed Hayes to form consolidated theories, the most notable being that Douglas had planned to live off the grid from the start. The clean break from Nevada, probable use of aliases, and total absence of records, led Hayes to conclude Douglas had likely prepared cash reserves or off-system contacts to facilitate long-term disappearance. Still, no concrete evidence supported these theories, as every prior collection effort had failed to produce a single solid connecting link. The combination of isolated data points, massive information voids, and the erosion of witness reliability over time led Hayes to determine that traditional investigative avenues had reached their absolute limit. Continuing to chase unsubstantiated guesses would be fruitless and wasteful. After completing his detailed synthesis, he executed the formal procedure to seal the file under cold case protocol for cases deemed currently unexpandable. The file was reorganized, coded, and placed in the state's central cold case repository, alongside other decades-old missing persons cases, with instructions to flag it if any new data ever surfaced through death records, identity systems, or civilian reports. This decision formally closed the traditional active investigation phase, moving the Ella Morgan case into indefinite waiting status, where the only remaining persistence lies in preserving information against the slim chance that one day a new clue finally appears. The fact that the file was sealed and disappeared from the active investigation stream does not change the reality that Ella was still growing up somewhere outside the reach of any official system, and her childhood story clearly reflects how Douglas once tried to sever ties with his old life. Ella was given a new name by Douglas right from the early stage after leaving Nevada, a simple new name, easy to blend into the crowd, unremarkable, and bearing no overlap with any data that Florence had ever existed in state records. This new identity became the protective shell Douglas built to avoid all tracing, and Ella, still too young to understand, accepted that name as a natural part of herself. The following years were marked by constant movement across many western and midwestern states in the U.S. Each place Douglas stopped was only for a short time, sometimes a few months, sometimes just a few weeks, before taking Ella to another town. The places the two lived were usually on the edges of communities, short-term rentals, mobile homes, or neighborhoods that attracted little attention. The root of this endless movement was never explained to Ella, but through traces of their daily life, it's clear that Douglas's goal was to avoid any stability that might require official paperwork or contact with schools. Throughout her childhood, Ella was never enrolled in the public education system. Her lessons came from old books Douglas bought at thrift markets or borrowed from small libraries that didn't require clear identification. Not attending school meant Ella had few opportunities to interact with peers, leading to a natural isolation from the normal life of children in any community. Doctors, hospitals, and clinics were also outside the scope Douglas allowed, except in cases where he had no choice but to buy medicine himself or treat things at home. As a result, Ella's living environment was always in flux, with no stable anchor. She grew used to packing up the few belongings they had whenever Douglas said it was time to go, used to living in temporary rented rooms, and used to never staying anywhere long enough to be recognized. This constant movement made Ella's life hazy in her memory, the towns, rooms, and roads all blurred together, never forming clear milestones. Douglas became the only fixed figure in Ella's life, creating a natural form of dependency. He decided where they lived, how they lived, when to leave and when not to, and controlled most of the information Ella had access to. To Ella, Douglas was the only person to rely on, the one who explained the world and drew the boundaries she had to follow. This dependency came not only from a childhood with no choices, but also from the absence of any other lasting relationships that could have given Ella a sense of belonging. Not being exposed to school, friends, or social services led Ella to gradually believe that her life had to unfold quietly and stay out of others' sight. Those years formed the foundation of a childhood cut off from society, where her real identity was buried, and her new identity belonged to no community, leaving Ella with a lingering sense of floating between places, growing up in constant motion under the guidance of the only person she could cling to in this ever-changing world. The relentless pace of movement in childhood pushed Ella into adulthood with no legal footing whatsoever, and as Douglas continued to maintain false identities for both of them, she was forced to use invalid documents as the only foundation for survival. The papers Douglas gave her, new name, new birth date, temporary addresses, were only enough to get past the minimum requirements of jobs that didn't do deep background checks or places that accepted cash-only rentals. When Ella reached the age where she had to find work herself, the difficulties became starkly clear. Any job requiring a valid Social Security number was out of reach. Small shops or restaurants that didn't dig too deep into backgrounds were her only options. Low pay and the instability of temporary jobs meant Ella could never settle anywhere for long. Renting a place also became a challenge because most landlords required verification paperwork. Ella could only sublet rooms in old houses or mobile home parks that didn't ask for contracts. This instability stretched on year after year, creating a loop she couldn't escape, because every attempt to improve her life required information she simply couldn't provide. At the same time, the restrictions tied to the legal and medical systems made Ella increasingly aware of the gap between herself and an ordinary citizen. She couldn't sign up for public health programs, couldn't open a proper bank account, couldn't sign employment contracts or long-term leases, and couldn't even do simple things like replace an ID or get a driver's license. Whenever she needed medical care, Ella could only go to free clinics or facilities that didn't ask for papers, and the quality of care depended more on luck than choice. This kept her in a constant state of alertness, avoiding anywhere that asked for even the smallest amount of personal information. As she grew older, and was no longer under Douglas's tight daily control, Ella began to notice huge gaps in what she knew about herself. The fragmented childhood memories and the stories Douglas had told about their origins didn't add up to a logical picture. She gradually realized that many of the stories he told changed over the years, and those inconsistencies made her suspect that something about her past was being hidden. In brief conversations with coworkers or temporary acquaintances, Ella always avoided talking about her childhood or family, not because she wanted to keep secrets, but because she didn't know what the true answers were. Not being able to say where she came from, who her relatives were, or even what her real birthday was created a lasting sense of vagueness, like living among disconnected pieces of memory. The absence of basic background information meant Ella carried a feeling of missing identity pieces through every step of growing up. She knew her name, but she also knew that name didn't fully belong to her. She saw the lives of people around her marked by clear milestones, birth certificates, schools, family, legal jobs, things that to Ella felt like a foreign world she couldn't touch. Over time that feeling became familiar, a thin layer between her and the rest of society. The fuzziness about her past meant she couldn't answer even simple questions about her origins, widening the gap between her and a stable life even further. For many years, Ella continued living that way, present but unrecorded, existing in a life with no files, no imprint on any system, and no way to ever know what had really happened to her as a child. The growing doubts about her own past came with no explanations from Douglas, and at some point in the mid-1990s, all of Ella's questions suddenly became meaningless because he vanished from her life without any warning. The disappearance carried no note, no hint of a destination, and no indication whether it was temporary or permanent. One morning, like so many others, Ella woke up in their small rented room and realized Douglas hadn't come back from his seasonal job the night before. The next day there was still no word. A week passed, then a month, and all that remained was total silence. Douglas leaving forced Ella to take full responsibility for a life in which she lacked every foundation an adult normally has. She still had the fake papers Douglas had prepared, but no skills or experience to create new ones if needed. Every transaction relied on cash. Every job was simple or temporary labor at places that didn't ask for records. Ella had to learn to budget, find cheap housing, stretch tiny paychecks, and handle medical issues with the bare minimum. This situation wasn't just material hardship, it was prolonged isolation. Ella had no one to turn to, no relatives, no close friends she could confide in, not even a legal foothold to start a real life. Continuing to use the false identity became the only way to survive. She knew full well that it blocked every chance of improvement. She couldn't train for a proper trade, couldn't get stable employment, couldn't sign long-term leases, and absolutely couldn't access any social safety net programs. But from Ella's point of view, holding on to that fragile false identity was still the only path that kept her from sliding into homelessness or permanent unemployment. In the long years living alone, Ella tried many times to search for traces of her origins, but she didn't know where to start. She had no real birth date, no birth certificate, no parents' names, no verifiable information beyond scattered memories of a house, a neighborhood, a woman's voice she wasn't even sure was real or just childhood imagination. Any attempt to search on her own was blocked by the total lack of personal data. Even if she wanted to ask someone, Ella didn't know what to ask, or which identity to use when asking. No leads, no complete story to tell, and no one who would believe she was the person she couldn't even prove she once was. The years after Douglas left made Ella realize that precarious living was no longer temporary. It had become the fixed structure of her life. Short-term jobs followed one after another, rented rooms changed constantly. Fleeting relationships never became anything solid. Any small risk, getting sick, losing a job, being asked to verify identity, could threaten the fragile existence she was trying to maintain. Douglas's disappearance didn't just force Ella to fend for herself, it also stripped away the last remaining link to her past, leaving a void that could never be filled. In the silence that stretched on for years, Ella kept living between two worlds, a legal world she could not enter, and a makeshift world built on an identity that wasn't hers, but was the only thing keeping her life from falling apart. Living in an identity that didn't belong to her had lasted long enough to become a habit, but in the 2010s, when civilian DNA testing services began to become widespread, Ella first saw a possibility, however vague, to find out if among the millions of genomes stored on online platforms, there was anyone who bore signs of similarity to her. The decision to participate in the testing didn't come from a desire to find her family, a thought that Ella had never believed she had the right to hope for, but from the prolonged impasse about her identity. She wanted to know at least one real thing about herself, even if it was just her genetic origin. Sending the test sample was simple, and Ella didn't think much about it after completing it. However, when she received the results online, she was unexpectedly faced with information unlike any data she had ever had. The system displayed a list of genetic connections with a high degree of similarity, suggesting close kinship, including some individuals sharing DNA segments that couldn't appear randomly. This caused confusion mixed with curiosity in Ella, as she had never thought she had any living relatives, let alone that they were somewhere in a civilian database. Upon closer examination, she noticed a particular point: many connections shared a common extended family group, with a similarity strong enough to suggest a direct lineage. This was something that couldn't be explained by the history Douglas had once told, which was always vague and never mentioned relatives. The appearance of this extended family group showed that Ella not only belonged to some genome in the data, but was also attached to a real family, a family from which she didn't know she had been separated. Like all civilian DNA testing services, Ella's data was automatically entered into an expanded connection suggestion system, and according to the policy of cooperation with law enforcement agencies, DNA matches with high overlap to lingering missing persons profiles were transferred to a passive matching algorithm to detect potential matching cold cases. Ella didn't know that when she clicked the button to agree to share data for research purposes, her genetic information had entered this process. At a point not long after, the system detected a particularly high genetic similarity between Ella and a profile in the long-term missing children category, specifically an unresolved case from the early 1970s. Although Ella was unaware, this match automatically triggered the internal notification procedure of the Federal Investigative Support Unit, where strong DNA matches would be flagged for further evaluation. That notification flow didn't happen noisily. It occurred in the background of the data system, transferring the results from the civilian platform to the functional agency's server, where a technician specializing in genetic matching received an alert that a new DNA sample matched a profile lingering for over 4 decades. This small event, starting from the decision to learn about herself through a civilian test, had inadvertently opened a data stream that Ella didn't know could exist, causing her gene verification process to connect directly for the first time to a case that had been filed away as hopeless in finding the victim. The automatic notification flow triggered from the civilian DNA testing system quickly appeared in the processing queue of the cold case unit under the State Attorney General's office, where high-priority alerts related to long-term missing profiles were flagged for manual review. When the genetic analysis technician opened the file containing the notification, the genetic similarity model displayed an overlap level too high to ignore: an adult female with strong matching indicators to the Ella Morgan profile, the child who disappeared in 1972. The probability algorithm almost ruled out the possibility of random coincidence, forcing the cold case unit to forward this alert to the investigator in charge of the original profile. Leonard Hayes, who had once reviewed the entire case before the file was sealed, received the notification and immediately had the document file he had once compiled reopened. The civilian DNA match was only the first step. The official procedure required direct genetic comparison with blood relatives, and in this case the only surviving person in the profile system was Marilyn Carter, Ella's mother. Hayes contacted the victim support unit to confirm that Marilyn was still living in Nevada, and still maintained registration as a relative in her daughter's missing profile. When informed of the possibility of a DNA match appearing, Marilyn, now over 70, immediately agreed to provide a test sample for verification. Her sample was collected according to modern procedures and sent to the Federal Genetic Analysis Lab, where technicians conducted a direct comparison with the DNA sample transferred from the civilian system. When the two data sets were placed in the same analysis, the degree of similarity yielded results clearly exceeding the mother-child confirmation threshold. The matching gene segments were long enough and consistent enough to affirm no statistical error, not just related, but direct biological kinship. This was information that 44 years of traditional investigation could not provide. That result changed the entire status of the case in an instant. The cold case unit immediately reported to the State Attorney General's office that the victim was confirmed alive based on modern genetic evidence. The file recovery procedure was activated. The file was retrieved from sealed storage, transferred to active status, and assigned a priority code to deploy the next steps. The two offices, state and federal, began exchanging data on the false identity that Ella had used in her adult years, provided by the civilian testing system. Meanwhile, a new investigative team was assigned, including investigators familiar with modern identity investigation, tracing technology, and coordinating long-term victim support. The team's first task was to verify Ella's current identity, place of residence, documents she was using, living environment, and level of safety. Approaching a victim who had used a false identity for nearly half a century required caution, as Ella's life could be strongly disrupted if approached incorrectly. At the same time, the investigators had to ensure she didn't fall into a new situation causing danger or psychological stress. The team chose a step-by-step approach, first determining Ella's actual location through customer information provided by the DNA testing service under legal request, then cross-checking with citizen records, rental registrations, and small traces in commercial data. Although Ella had once lived in anonymity, the minimal transactions in adult life still left faint marks in the system, enough for investigators to follow. When the current residence was confirmed in a small town in California, the investigative team built a safe approach plan, avoiding causing panic or sudden intervention in Ella's life. The goal was not only to confirm identity, but also to protect the rights of a victim separated from her family since childhood. The involved parties agreed that the notification must be carried out by an investigator experienced in contacting long-term victims, in a clear step-by-step explanation manner, avoiding psychological shock. The plan included the possibility of Ella initially refusing cooperation due to never knowing she was a victim of a kidnapping. Establishing this plan marked the first transition of the case from storage status to active again, laying the foundation for the final verification phase, and paving the way for the truth about Ella, after 44 years to be clarified, based on scientific evidence that did not exist at the time the case occurred. When the DNA result confirming Ella was alive was sent to the State Attorney General's office, the case was immediately assigned to Detective Amanda Sullivan, who specialized in handling long-term missing profiles involving identity changes and modern identity tracing. Sullivan received all the documents from the time the traditional investigation ended, and the summary that investigator Hayes had prepared before the case was sealed. Her first task was to reconstruct the overall picture based on the old timeline, while placing it in the context of possible movement and behavior inferred from the new DNA data. The timeline from 1972 to 1978 was reviewed by Sullivan in every detail, looking for points of potential breakage or those overlooked due to technological limitations of that era. Verified milestones such as the time Douglas appeared in Fernley, information from the gas station, where the car was abandoned, witness reports in Idaho, Utah, and finally the time when clues ran out, were all attached back to the timeline diagram. Sullivan added a new layer of analysis, evaluating the movement behavior of those actively living outside the system in the 1970s. Based on similarities with similar cases in modern data archives, she determined that Douglas very likely changed his identity right after abandoning the car, and if he had prepared in advance, creating a simple fake identity at that time was entirely feasible. To determine Douglas's direction of disappearance, Sullivan expanded to a data source that the previous generation of investigators could not access: the list of unidentified dissident profiles, UID. Unidentified dissident, stored in federal and interstate systems. By using filters for gender, age, region, and time frame within the range from 1972 to the 2000s, she obtained a list of unidentified dissident cases matching Douglas's description. These profiles were cases where identification documents did not exist or were invalid, often people who died from accidents, illnesses, or non-criminal causes, but no one came forward to identify. Sullivan reviewed each profile, comparing physical features, surgical marks, height, bone structure, and biological age signs with Douglas's profile before disappearance. The list quickly narrowed to a few cases, including one from California, in the late 1990s, once discovered on a suburban traffic route and not matching any civilian data at that time. Parallel to checking suspicious dissidents, Sullivan utilized digital tracing technology that modern investigative units rely on, including analysis of temporary residence patterns, fake identity overlaps, and historical administrative data of states, information that Douglas could not imagine existed when he first disappeared. By filtering through rental registration data, demographic reports, seasonal employment records, and old vehicle registration systems, Sullivan followed small but recurring signs of male individuals, using single names or without clear tax history. These patterns often appeared in continuously moving communities, logging areas, temporary factories, construction sites, or small towns along highways, and Sullivan noticed a familiar pattern, matching Douglas's behavior in the early phase, when he took Ella across multiple states. This analysis helped Sullivan hypothesize that Douglas did not change vehicles only once, but likely maintained the movement pattern for many years before settling or encountering an incident. The list of possibilities related to Douglas was narrowed to 3 directions. He continued living under a new identity until death. He ended his journey in a state without documents and died unidentified, or he may have left faint traces in the local legal system, but never linked to the original missing profile. With these 3 directions, Sullivan used identity analysis algorithms to simulate Douglas's possible path based on the location where the car was abandoned, the typical movement speed of people living outside the system, and common temporary residence points in the 1970s, 90s. The results showed the highest probability in the California and Oregon areas, where the number of unidentified dissidents was higher than average, and there were many short-term residence patterns. Narrowing this list allowed Sullivan to focus on the group of most suitable unidentified dissident profiles, especially the dissident case from Fresno found in 1997, which matched many behavioral factors that Douglas could converge. At the same time, identifying Ella's current location made verifying Douglas's identity even more urgent, because if he was dead, her journey would need a different approach compared to if he was still alive. All these modern analyses were compiled by Sullivan into the file, preparing for the final comparison phase, to draw a clear conclusion about Douglas's disappearance, after more than 4 decades. The hypotheses Sullivan built from modern data quickly led her back to an unidentified corpse file in Fresno, California, a case that had appeared on the final filtered list and bore numerous similarities to Douglas's disappearance pattern. The file documented a middle-aged man found beside a suburban roadway in 1997, with no identification, no matching missing person report from that time, and all prior attempts at identification had failed. The descriptors in the autopsy report, height, bone structure, biological age range, old scars on the left hand, all matched the characteristics Douglas had in the 1972 records. Even more telling was the location where the body was discovered. It lay along a route Sullivan had flagged as high probability in the travel model for where Douglas might have gone after abandoning his vehicle and living under assumed identities for years. To confirm, a DNA comparison process was initiated. Since no direct sample from Douglas was available, Sullivan used Ella's DNA as the reference for a parent-child match. Preserved bone and tissue samples from the 1997 corpse were retrieved from the California Forensic Archives and sent to a federal lab. Genetic analysis was performed using modern kinship matching methods, comparing specific gene segments between the corpse and Ella to determine potential father-daughter relationship. The results did not surprise Sullivan but were decisive for the entire case. The genetic match reached the threshold for clear parent-child confirmation, completely eliminating any chance of error. This proved Douglas had died in 1997, ending a decades-long anonymous existence that began when he took Ella from Nevada. With Douglas's fate settled, Sullivan began piecing together the full timeline from 1972 to 1997. The chain of evidence showed Douglas had left Fernley heading northeast, then traveled through Idaho and Utah as initially hypothesized, before continuing south into California. The complete absence of administrative traces indicated he lived on cash, took seasonal jobs, and constantly moved to avoid detection. Scattered data fragments from temporary residences, short-term rental records, and vague witness statements from small towns were assembled into a fragmented but consistent journey that perfectly fit the profile of someone trying to disappear from all identification systems. By the late 1990s, Douglas appeared to have become physically exhausted or suffered a sudden health event, leading to his death on the roadside, unidentified. No evidence suggested foul play in his death. It was simply the natural end of a life spent in hiding, far from any family or system that once knew him. Confirming Douglas was dead not only completed the remaining 44-year timeline, but also carried profound implications for Ella's present situation. His death removed any lingering safety threat she might have faced if he were still alive, and freed her from the invisible fear that many child abduction victims carry, the fear that the person who took them might return at any moment. From this point, the case shifted entirely from searching for both victim and suspect to the process of formally restoring Ella's true identity, secure in the knowledge that the past threat was permanently over. The confirmation of Douglas's death gave Sullivan the legal and psychological foundation to take the most critical step, contacting Ella under her current identity, a task that required absolute caution to avoid disrupting her already fragile life. Using data from civilian DNA databases combined with minor transactions Ella had made, Sullivan located her residence in a quiet California town, where she lived on seasonal work and paid cash for a small rented room. Sullivan chose a direct but non-abrupt approach, appearing at the address as a government representative, needing to verify identity related to an old case. Ella was initially guarded. She had spent years learning to avoid any interaction involving authorities, but Sullivan's patient demeanor and explanation gradually opened her up enough to hear the reason for the visit. The first step was examining the documents Ella was using. Everything she presented showed classic signs of fabricated identity, information that did not link to any official civil records, a social security number that did not match issuance cycles, and registered addresses that had vanished over time. Sullivan had no intention of charging Ella. Clearly she was only using what Douglas had left her to survive, so the verification process was gentle, focused on understanding how she had lived without a real identity. As trust slowly formed, Ella agreed to share the few old items she still kept after Douglas disappeared. They were stored in a small box, a few loose photographs, a notebook of Douglas's scattered notes, an old ring whose origin she didn't remember, and some faded papers. To Ella, they were unexplained keepsakes. To Sullivan they were crucial missing pieces of the 1972-1997 timeline. Douglas's notebook contained disjointed entries about temporary jobs, travel routes, and dates he needed to leave an area due to unwanted attention. Though nothing was explicit, the notes aligned with data Sullivan had already gathered from the unidentified corpse file and scattered administrative records, confirming Douglas's presence in multiple locations over 2 decades. One small photo of Ella, as a young child, one of the few remaining, served as evidence linking her journey to Douglas, since the background location matched a town on the suspect list of places he had passed through. These items were analyzed to solidify the timeline, especially periods when Ella was too young to remember, or when Douglas deliberately withheld information from her. Cross-referencing the physical evidence with geographic data, temporary residence records, and seasonal labor reports produced a far more detailed travel map, connecting the years Ella lived in hiding to the traces Douglas had left behind. When all the data, DNA, physical evidence, timeline, and Ella's own statements were combined, Sullivan had sufficient grounds to officially confirm Ella Morgan's true identity. This rested not only on the direct genetic link to Marilyn, but also on the high correlation between the physical evidence and the reconstructed movement pattern of Douglas. With rigorous analysis and solid proof, Sullivan completed the verification report, declaring Ella to be the little girl who disappeared in 1972, closing the identity investigation phase and opening the next step of returning this truth to Ella in the most complete and responsible way possible. Once Ella's true identity was confirmed, Sullivan's next task was to formally notify Marilyn Carter, the mother who had lived 4 decades waiting without answers. The call was made under carefully prepared conditions, because Sullivan knew the news carried too much weight to deliver abruptly. When Sullivan told her the DNA match confirmed Ella was alive, Marilyn fell into prolonged silence, then burst into tears, unable to speak. What required careful handling was not only Marilyn's emotions but also preparing both women psychologically. Ella, having just learned her entire life, was built on a fabricated identity, now had to face the reality that she had a family who had searched for her for over 40 years. Sullivan spent time speaking privately with Ella, explaining every step and assuring her that no one expected an immediate reaction or would force her to meet Marilyn if she wasn't ready. Ella needed to understand that reunion was her choice, not an obligation. At the same time, Sullivan and the victim support unit worked with Marilyn, helping her understand that Ella had lived under abnormal conditions and that any meeting had to be built on respect for her daughter's emotions, without imposing expectations or overwhelming reactions. After both expressed willingness to move forward, Sullivan began selecting the reunion location. The site had to meet 3 criteria: safe, neutral, and free from public or media interruption. The best choice was a victim support office within a police department in a midpoint city, offering private space, warm lighting, and separation from regular administrative areas. This allowed both parties room to process emotions without social pressure or too many people present. The meeting followed protocol developed specifically for reunions after decades of separation, including having mother and daughter arrive in separate rooms first, to avoid instant shock. A clinical psychologist was on site to assist if emotions exceeded safe levels. No time limit was set to prevent added stress. Support staff were instructed to remain far enough away to preserve privacy, but close enough to respond quickly if needed. Sullivan spent final moments with both Marilyn and Ella discussing what might happen in that first moment: overwhelming joy, silence, confusion, or even awkwardness. Any reaction was normal. This was a meeting reconnecting 2 lives torn apart far too long ago. Finally, when everything was ready, the reunion day was set, opening the moment that had seemed impossible for 44 years since Ella vanished from that small house in Nevada. The reunion took place in a quiet room, where soft lighting was deliberately arranged to avoid any sense of tension. Ella arrived first with Sullivan, while Marilyn was guided in later to prevent a sudden encounter. When the door opened slowly, and Marilyn stepped inside, her trembling steps nearly froze at the sight of the young woman rising from a chair on the other side of the room. Neither spoke in those first seconds. The silence carried the weight of 4 severed decades, as if time itself had to slow down to let memory catch up with the present. Ella saw Marilyn's face, the thin lines of age, the eyes that still held a gentleness she couldn't clearly remember yet, somehow felt instinctively familiar. Marilyn raised a hand to her mouth, tears spilling uncontrollably, while Ella simply stood still, letting waves of emotion, both foreign and intimate, wash over her. Finally, when the distance between them shrank with a single step, Ella softly spoke the name, Marilyn, and Marilyn answered with her true name, Ella. That moment shattered the invisible barrier between their two lives, and they fell into each other's arms in a long, trembling, tear-soaked embrace. The meeting grew gentler. Once the initial flood of emotion subsided, they began studying each other more closely, a kind of visual confirmation that no DNA match, however powerful, could replace. Ella had her mother's deep brown eyes, the same gently arched eyebrows, and the same shy glance Marilyn remembered from photographs of her daughter had taken when she was only 4. Marilyn reached out with shaking fingers to touch Ella's hair, as if trying to match memory against the reality in front of her. "You look so much like me," she whispered, and Ella could only nod, unsure what to say. Once everyone had settled, Sullivan stepped back, giving mother and daughter space to talk about the lives that had been torn apart. Ella spoke of the years of constant moving, rented rooms, unstable jobs, and the feeling of never truly belonging anywhere. She spoke evenly and carefully, not to hurt Marilyn, but simply to describe what had happened. Marilyn listened in silence, occasionally wiping tears, not because Ella's words wounded her, but because every detail was proof of the life that had been stolen from them both, a life she had been powerless to protect. In turn, Marilyn shared the years of searching, the false leads, the cycles of hope and despair, and how she had kept Ella's room untouched for decades, as a way to hold on to memory. Ella didn't know how to respond. She simply reached for Marilyn's hand to make up in some small way for the years that could never return. While they talked, Sullivan occasionally asked gentle questions to gather information for the remaining gaps in the file, mostly about Douglas's journey, aliases he had used, memorable stops, or any unusual details Ella could recall. Not every question had an answer, but each small piece she provided strengthened the inferences Sullivan had already built. Every detail that matched the analysis was noted to complete the investigative file, ensuring every aspect of the case was fully documented for official closure. As the meeting neared its end, Sullivan performed the final step of the process, solidifying identity verification for Ella. This relied not only on DNA, but also on cross-referencing biological traits, physical evidence, and the timeline Ella herself confirmed. Together these elements formed a unified, complete documentation, proving that Ella Morgan, the child who vanished in 1972, was truly sitting in front of them. The reunion did not close with words, but with a long clasp of hands between mother and daughter, a silent promise that the years stolen could never return, but the years ahead could begin to be rebuilt from this moment. After the reunion, Ella faced a new journey, the first chance in her life to give herself a real identity, no longer based on the fake papers Douglas had left behind. Sullivan and the Victim Support Unit guided her through the initial legal steps, restoring her true name, Ella Morgan, in the civil registry system. This was not simple for someone who had lived her entire life under a false identity, but thanks to direct-line DNA confirmation and coordination with the Nevada courts, the process was handled as a special case for childhood abduction victims. Ella had to sign affidavits about her living circumstances, provide information from the investigation, and confirm she had never had any legal record under her real name. Once completed, a new civil record was created based on the original 1972 data, restoring her true birth date, parents' names, and status located, alive. With this step, Ella officially reappeared in the U.S. legal system, after more than 44 years erased from the map of American identity. She then began the next steps to stabilize her life, obtaining valid ID, applying for a real social security number, and opening bank accounts, things most people take for granted, but for Ella, they were like laying the foundation stones of a new life. In the following days, Ella spent time rediscovering her family history, something she had never had the chance to do. Marilyn helped her look through old photos, told her about Ella's early childhood before the abduction, and introduced her to relatives she had never known existed. The family stories broken by the kidnapping were slowly pieced back together, helping Ella imagine the life she should have had. Not every moment was easy. Sometimes Ella's blank spaces of memory made it hard to absorb new information, but Marilyn stayed beside her, patiently filling decades-long gaps. Gradually, Ella learned to settle into her new life. She found legal work under her real name, rented a stable place to live, and began building relationships without the constant fear of being discovered or having to hide. Life was no longer constrained by fear and dependence, and Ella began to feel freedom, something she hadn't realized she had lost until she got it back. At the same time, the investigative agency completed the final step, updating the case status in the legal system. Ella Morgan's file changed from missing not located to identified, victim alive, with a full report added detailing the cause of disappearance, Douglas's anonymous journey, and all evidence collected during the reinvestigation. This was not mere paperwork, it was the agency's way of ensuring Ella's full story was recorded so it could never sink into darkness again. Even though Ella's identity had been restored, and Douglas's fate determined, the case left many questions that could never be fully closed, because some parts of a journey, spanning more than 4 decades, simply cannot be filled by any record, witness, or DNA. Douglas's true motive for taking Ella in 1972 remains unclear. There were no letters, no explanations, no notes indicating he acted out of fear of losing custody, family conflict, or mental instability. The scattered notes in the notebook he left behind only reflect how he lived, not why he started. Calculated plan, impulse, or a distorted sense of protecting his child, no one can say for certain. Whether Douglas received help from anyone in the early stages of the journey was never verified. Changing vehicles or being picked up immediately after abandoning the car suggests some level of preparation, but the investigation found no connection to any individual who might have assisted. No receipts, no financial trail, no communication. If an accomplice existed, they vanished completely from view. The gaps in Douglas's timeline, especially the early years after leaving Nevada, and the period before his death in Fresno, are too large to reconstruct fully. Although the timeline was partially rebuilt using physical evidence and behavioral inference, dozens of years remain unknown: where he lived, what he did, who he was with. He may have changed identities multiple times, moved through small communities that left no trace, or lived in areas where civil records were weak. Missed opportunities in the original investigation also weigh on the detectives. A few early witness reports might have had value if re-examined with modern technology. Secondary vehicle clues might have been confirmed had traffic cameras existed. Douglas's post-mortem records might have been matched sooner had a national DNA database existed in the 1990s. But those are what-ifs that technology and the era did not allow. Looking back, the investigators understand that although modern technology brought the story to a conclusion, some questions can never be answered definitively. Why didn't Douglas abandon Ella when she was still little, and instead continue raising her? Why did he disappear from her life in 1990, without ever trying to return or leave a sign? Did he feel guilt, fear, or simply want to continue his anonymous life alone? Even Ella cannot answer for herself, because Douglas never explained, and the years with him left only vague feelings, not enough to form clear truth. In the end, the case closed not by resolving every mystery, but by accepting that some parts of the journey will forever remain in the shadows of history, a reminder that even when modern technology can find a lost person, it cannot recover the entire story that vanished with time. The case's unanswered questions do not diminish the power of what is clearest. Ella's return after 44 years is living proof that modern DNA technology can resurrect records long thought permanently forgotten. This case shows that a tiny genetic sample, separated from all paperwork or personal history, can still become the key that reopens a door past generations of investigators were powerless to unlock. because of the limits of their era. DNA, as an unforgeable biological signature, has become the foundation for breaking through walls of time, allowing victim identification without relying on statements, memories, or documents, things easily erased over the years. At the same time, the case underscores the importance of preserving investigative records, even when decades pass without progress. All the data carefully saved by Leonard Hayes and earlier generations of detectives, initial statements, physical evidence, vehicle descriptions, location where the car was found, became the foundation for today's investigators to piece the puzzle back together, cross-reference with new technology, and reconstruct the story in a way impossible in 1972. Without that preservation, even with DNA, the system would have had nothing to match Ella's sample against among thousands of missing persons cases each year. Long-term efforts to find missing victims are another prominent message of this case. No matter how much time passes, the will to keep files active, listen to new tips, and continually update data can create the opportunity for a case to come back to life. Not every missing person case ends in reunion, but persistence, and refusing to close the door on hope, gave law enforcement the foundation to recognize Ella when DNA technology finally advanced enough to do what once seemed unimaginable. The impact of the case extends beyond the Morgan family to the wider community and law enforcement nationwide. The story has become an example of how cooperation between civil systems and legal agencies can resolve long-dormant cold cases. It encourages the public to keep participating in voluntary DNA testing programs, creating larger databases to help solve cases. Many state agencies have begun reviewing how they store, digitize, and connect data across units to build stronger networks for cold cases. And finally, there is a purely human meaning that no technology or procedure can fully describe. Finding a victim after decades does not only bring closure to their family, it restores the stolen memories of the victim herself. Ella did not just get her real name back, she was given the chance to live the rest of her life with the truth, a gift not every missing person is fortunate enough to receive. Despite the journey here was filled with countless losses, the reunion after 4 decades still reminds us that justice, over time, can take many forms. Sometimes it is not punishment, but finding the person who was once lost. The story of Ella Morgan, abducted by her own father in 1972, and found only thanks to a commercial DNA testing more than 40 years later, is not only a thrilling case, but also a clear reflection of life in America today. Many American parents still think danger comes from strangers, but Ella's case shows that the risk of abduction by a family member is the one few prepare for. Douglas didn't use immediate violence. He appeared as a normal father, asked to take his child out for a few hours, then disappeared. The practical lesson for families is in custody disputes: never downplay the risk of parental abduction, do everything through the courts, have clear custody orders, report any violation by a relative to authorities immediately, and never handle it quietly on your own. Marilyn's persistence in keeping the file active, cooperating with police, and agreeing to submit her DNA is the reason that in the 2010s, the system had data to match when Ella unknowingly used a commercial DNA service. In today's America, where genetic genealogy testing is commonplace, this story reminds us to think carefully about privacy, but also to recognize the power of controlled data sharing. It really can help find missing people and identify unknown remains. On the community side, the fact that citizens reported the abandoned car, a gas station worker remembered the father and daughter, all show that every small detail has value, even if results don't come immediately. For investigators, Hayes's careful preservation of the timeline and evidence shows that doing the file right isn't just for today's report, but so someone 40 years later has a foundation to keep going. In a vast, mobile, and sometimes isolated society like the United States, Ella's story reminds us of 3 very concrete things: Protect your children with law, not just emotion. Value proper preservation and sharing of information, and never underestimate the enduring power of those who refuse to stop searching for the people they love. Thank you for following the 44-year journey to find Ella Morgan again. If stories full of hope like this touch you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other cases closed. Thanks to the power of community and modern justice. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring true stories that remind us that even after decades, the truth can still come home.